Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar where Sitecore and Sagittarius are going to be discussing how CDPs have shaped personalization in financial services. And I'm really pleased that we're having this conversation. You know, the talks and conversations I have with customers, this is in financial services, this is a big topic. And I'm also really pleased to have a really important partner to us here at Sitecore, Sagittarius, join us. And we've got Ian, their CEO, joining us to discuss this topic and explore how financial services are managing their data and how they're using it to drive digital expertise. And just to introduce myself, so my name is Mike Plimsoll, and I'm Senior Director, Industry Strategy and Marketing here at Sitecore. So I lead a team of industry experts that will help customers understand industry trends, best practices, how, what's disrupting the industry, and how the leaders are responding to that. And also looking at, how Sitecore and our partners can help them to achieve what they want. And so on that, I mentioned partners and, Ian, this is a great time to have you guys talk about this. You've been doing some research in this area. So do you want to maybe, spend a bit of time just introducing yourself to the audience and then maybe giving us a bit of a background on the research and the white paper that you've been doing?
Thanks. Yeah, so just to kind of introduce myself a little bit. So I'm Ian, as Mike said. I've been in digital for 30 years. I've worked across something like 15,000 major projects, sounds like a lot. And that's across all sectors. And I've been kind of brand side and consultancy side and agency side. And I've been everything from CMO for NSPCC and Childline, leading their kind of famous full stop campaign, right through to kind of more recent work with really commercial brands like Apple, Nike, Red Bull, those type of brands. I now head up Sagittarius. We're a Sitecore Global Platinum partner, and I lead the agency's mission to kind of create or help great brands make Sitecore really kind of as a platform and a group of technologies fire on all cylinders, just so brands can kind of create experiences that really convert. In terms of context for the white paper, I suppose, we like to publish something new and interesting every quarter around some of our kind of key verticals that we work in. And it's something that we're passionate about, and we like to kind of dig underneath and kind of find a key pain point for our audience. So with this piece of research, we've surveyed hundreds and hundreds of key decision makers in the UK-based financial businesses, and that ranges from banks, insurances, and other service providers. And outside of the agency, it's just to add value and kind of stimulate conversation among CMOs, CTOs and their teams. But inside the agency, it's part of our kind of knowledge sharing, and it's key to kind of our mission of creating experiences that convert for kind of related brands in the sector. In this case, it's the type of knowledge that will help us work with, somebody like a brand like Lion Trust on asset management, or ICIS on kind of chemical and energy market intelligence, or even Moody Analytics on kind of risk expertise. So we use that kind of knowledge to just enhance what we kind of give to our clients or the brands that we might be working with in future.
Brilliant. No, thank you for the overview. And these are all the things that we're going to be discussing today. What I haven't said, we are recording this session as well, so it will be available on demand. And obviously, we'll be sharing the research after the session as well. And so I'm going to just stop sharing my screen quickly. So Ian, you've gone through this research. What are some of the big headlines that we can perhaps discuss, and what are the key things that are sort of coming out of the research that you're finding?
I think I'll avoid giving hard stats and strict percentages because you can access the report for the kind of detail. But it's clear to me that the financial sector has always been at the forefront of kind of data-driven innovation between the rise of compliance requirements and rapid digitalization of process, today's banks and insurance companies and financial services providers, I think, are some of the heaviest users of data in the world. But once you get under the skin of that, it's really interesting. And what we found was really surprising is that, only 2/3 collect personal data, and then only half of brands actually use that. Now, so some of the, so it's almost like in our minds, we've definitely got them as leaders, but there are still some challenges within that. And I think, I should highlight that doesn't mean that financial brands don't kind of see this stuff as really, really important. We saw something like 8 out of 10 decision makers believing that data would absolutely improve their customer journey. It'll help them predict customer behavior. So it's clear that there's kind of both, incredibly valuable upsides to getting this right. But I think the biggest thing that comes out, it's almost a golden thread that's in all of the numbers, is the kind of spread of digital maturity across the sector is quite wide. And what I mean by that really is that kind of the technologies and the strategy and the processes used can be dated quite accurately, I suppose, in terms of when those were prevalent or when those trends were really, really popular. And it's roughly about a 15-year span from good to bad. Now, that might sound acceptable. It's not a huge amount of time, right? 15 years is like, goes by in a heartbeat. I think, both my children were born, before that. NASA launched the Mars lander. I can even remember Alicia Dixon winning Strictly Come Dancing. But I think if you talk about digital and kind of data in that experience terms, and then think about 15 years, that's pre-social media revolution. That's pre-iPhone, obviously pre-Internet of Things. And big things that we now talk about, really easily, like Amazon Cloud, that was in beta, and Microsoft Azure services didn't even exist, it hadn't been invented. So that gives you a sense of 15 years is a chasm. And I just think just a really light touch example of that is almost like right now in the financial sector in 2022, here's a great one, right? Our data shows that 1 in 6 brands do not segment their audience. They haven't got to that yet. So that's an illustration of that 15-year gap in action, I think, and that appears in our data. So I think I've got a question for you, really, Mike, is clearly from the numbers that we see, they're kind of, brands are obsessing over the data. But the real question from us, and that's not, it's more to Sitecore, this is not evident in the research, is are they actually using it?
It's a really good question. And, I think every customer I've spoken to is on a journey. And one of the customers we have at Sitecore, who we believe is doing some really good things with data, is AIB, Allied Irish Bank. So most of you probably know them as one of the largest banks in Ireland. And I think it's going back to the stats that you were saying about the 2/3 collect personal data, but 8 out of 10 believe data will improve the customer journey. And it's where do you start and what journey do you go on? And I believe AIB have been going on that journey, and it started out being very simple with just collecting data on the website, personalizing the homepage carousel, and then it branched out to connecting to the AIB Comms Hub in order to send out personalized in-branch appointment reminders, confirmations, and things like that via email and SMS. And again, layering on, more data over time, getting into the manage my card section to proactively prompt users. So there are lots of things that we're seeing, and it's not a kind of you do everything at once. And we know that if you start to do things small and just very simple things, by improving that carousel on the homepage, you start to improve that customer journey. And so I think the stats that you're getting are so true in the conversations I'm having with customers. Everyone sees it as important, but they're struggling to know what data to collect and how. And so, I think that if you can start small and you can build up over time and grow that data, you can start to get some great results. And I think this comes out in some of the key findings that you were talking about. So, I think, there's only 2 or 3 in that you and I discussed. What then do you think, the first key finding, what is it that the first finding that the research found?
I think probably the first standout piece is really about unpicking that kind of myth of a single customer view. So one of the big stats was that less than half of brands collect CRM or contact center data. So again, that's kind of like less than half. What the other half doing? And then that kind of drops down even further to about a third when you start to talk about analyzing mobile behavior. And again, that's a real surprise for us. If you think as consumers, there's an awful lot of fairly good apps in that space, let's say. And yet actually only a third of brands are analyzing that data. So that's fascinating. That means they're putting things in market just to be in market instead of actually letting them benefit their business as they truly can. But I suppose in that space, retail banks definitely are the strongest performers, but still only a quarter of brands would say that they have a complete view of who buys their services and their products. So, it's a bit of a harsh phrase, but an awful lot of serious brands are flying blind in that space. And I think that's a major challenge. So with kind of brands that want to build that accurate view, do you think they're kind of getting a useful view of their customers? Obviously, I've mentioned a few stats there, but are they actually building out what they need to build out? What's your view on that, Mike?
I think they're starting to, and I think that there's all sorts of challenges which we can go into, but the stats that you were talking about certainly align with what we were seeing around the importance of data, and getting that deeper understanding of the customer. And there's stats that really do confirm and support the Sagittarius research around the investment to improve customer experience, the need for data, improving that data collection. So I'm not surprised that it's saying that, but what about, I kind of think about some of the things that we need to do and try and understand, because if we try and demystify data a little bit, what sort of data is there? And so when I sort of think about it, some of the examples of the data, it might be data that comes straight from a bank. So you think about, so you mentioned retail banks were some of the leaders in this space. So, if we think about some of the things that they're doing, it's capturing, spending goals in apps where, you're as a consumer, you're entering that information. So that's a consumer giving information. But then it might be an action like, depositing or withdrawing cash. So something like that. So that data all resides within CRM systems, transaction systems that we can start to take. Then there's data that we see from browsing behavior. And, how do we start to understand what are people looking at, there's temporal variables like day of week, time of day that influence, every Monday, the same customer's looking at the same credit card, things like that can help you sort of understand where a consumer is. Then there's, clickstream data. So this is kind of the real live stuff of, I've just done a mortgage calculator to find out how much I can get. And, that can trigger a lot, and you need that data in real time. And then the final area is, being able to onboard data from third parties. And how do you, risk data, Experian data around risk models, things like that, credit scores and things. And so this is one of the ways that we see customers start to segment and structure their data so that they can start to prioritize against the use cases that they have. And so in the end, it kind of ends up looking a bit like this, where you go, right, we and this is quite a busy slide, I know, but it's all about how do we, stream data into that click stream data, that behavioral data. How do we use that? How do we connect with, transactional systems or batch, do something with it, and then activate it afterwards. And absolutely, there's no kind of, we don't start with trying to do everything. It's going back to the types of data that I've got here and going, well, which do you have access to easily? How can we use that? But having that roadmap and vision to know that you're going to be layering on more and more data over time. There's a great book, Harvard Business Review, that talks about sense and respond. And it talks about having a vision of where you want to get to, but it might be a bit blurry. You have a vague idea. Now, what you don't do is just run full steam ahead towards that target, because you don't really know exactly how to get there. So it's about sensing and responding. So start with some data, build a view of the consumer, get some results, and then start to build on that. And so I certainly think that that obsession with data, starting to build a view, you don't have to have an entire view to begin with. It can be partial. You can still get some great value from that. What about other findings?
Yeah, I think just looking at your slides, I kind of, it's easy for me to say, I suppose, as an agency person and a cycle agency at that, but I kind of look at those slides and the brand person in me is almost like, I want that. How do I get that? And I think that's really interesting. So we definitely see an appetite in the numbers, but probably the second key finding for us is about, what's getting in the way of that appetite. And we start to kind of unpack, you can see almost the barriers and the obstacles that get in the way of an accurate view of the customer. And there's a big divide between the brands that access the data. And I think this probably talks to that 15-year gap that I mentioned earlier. But encouragingly, half of the brands are using real-time dashboards. I think that's really, really exciting. Insurance companies are the leaders in this space, which is really interesting. But at the other extreme, a third of the sector is still relying on written reports. So again, it shows this kind of like haves and have-nots. And if you think about both of those type of the dashboard type of person and the written report type of person looking at just what you talked about, Mike, that's a completely different lens. For the dashboard person, that looks like the possible that you've just described. Probably somebody that's analyzing a written report will look at what you've just described and just think, how on earth do I start that? It's incredibly challenging, and I appreciate that. And within the kind of research that we did, as we kind of explored the obstacles, it seems that data appearing in multiple formats, which of course it does, right? But that seems like really, really high on the list of complexities and kind of pain points that brands can't seem to get around. I think a third of the sample are struggling with data hygiene. We talk about cleansing and processes and around data lakes and things quite a lot, but still a third are struggling with that. And they've got lots of out-of-date information. So they haven't even naturally got a customer experience that naturally keeps customer data up to date. So I think it's not much of a surprise that kind of big data has become a big problem. More than half of the businesses thought that it was too big a mountain to climb, which is a bit scary. But and that kind of goes up even more significantly if you're a brand that kind of serves both B2C and B2B. I suppose that's to do with the complexity and even more size of the data. But I don't think it's something that the sector can ignore. So those kind of frustrations around, is the task too big? Does that kind of resonate with you, Mike, at Sitecore? Is that something that you're actively seeking to help?
Absolutely. And again, some of the stats which we've seen that again support and validate what the Sagittarius research is, the number of data sources that every industry, not just financial services, has to deal with has grown almost exponentially over the last few years, with new channels and touch points emerging almost every day. This means we have to have better focus on data. And it's not always just a technology challenge. You know, sometimes there is a organizational challenge, you know, siloed teams where, you know, data is stored in different places physically, you know, and just how to get it from one place to another. You know, we being a technology company will look at solutions that solve this using technology and using composable architectures that can bring disparate data together and connect different data sources is certainly a technology approach. But yes, and you'll know through working with many customers that actually getting the inner workings of an organization to communicate, to have the right workflows and processes is also a big challenge. These aren't difficult to overcome. They're not easy, but you know, it's something that, yes, working with the right technology and the right partners, you can certainly overcome to build out that view. You know, going back to what I said earlier, I think it's often a case of, you know, can you, you know, create the right use cases to show what you're trying to do, to show the value that you're adding. And, you know, I think if you can do that, then you can start to move some of that frustration away. You can get more buy-in from the business. So Ian, so what the final, you know, I know there's sort of three key findings. What's the final thing that was coming out of the research?
Yeah, so I suppose it's a kind of it's a natural flow. So obviously the size of the data, the obstacles that brings, but I guess the kind of the holy grail and the reason that brands are interested in it is probably all around personalization. They want to be able to leverage that to customer data, of course. And so our last kind of major finding was definitely around the promise of that personalization. And this is something that we get quite animated about at Sagittarius, just because, you know, when done properly, it's a game changer, and we do it for a lot of our clients, and, you know, and it's great stuff. But it's really positive to see that the vast majority of the financial services sector that we certainly surveyed use some form of segmentation. Obviously, I mentioned the 1 in 6 earlier, but the 5 and 6 actually are doing something about it, and they're building it into their digital experience. So organizations obviously use different techniques in order to do that segmentation. So 2/3 of retail banking and insurance kind of focusing on demographics. That sort of makes sense, I think. That's where they get their greatest insight from. I'd argue that out of context, they might be missing a bit of a trick there, but that's up to them to solve, or to ask me to help them solve. And far fewer kind of rely on technographic segmentation. I think you've already touched on it slightly, but kind of digital culture definitely plays a big part in how that kind of segmentation is thought about or expressed within organizations. And we see half of investment banks embracing personalization, and they kind of lead the way in that. Whereas you just kind of flip that coin slightly into kind of wealth management, and that drops right down to something like 1 in 5. So 1 in 5 wealth management businesses are using kind of data-driven personas. That's not many at all. But the inspiring thing here is that actually we're seeing a kind of a tide of brands actively using, you know, artificial intelligence and machine learning in order to kind of analyze their data sets. So I think that's a really, really brilliant move. And that kind of plays back to the thing I said at the start, where the sector definitely leads in innovation around data in many, many ways. And, you know, kind of nearly half of the brands are saying that they're greatly improving customer satisfaction and turbo boosting conversion with kind of revenue per customer simply by doing that analysis. So again, it's already kind of huge benefits, and it's paving the way for what they'll do next. So probably finally from me, there's a bit of a question really around, you know, before we kind of move into some audience questions from attendees. I'm interested in, you know, there's play on that personalization piece. How can brands leverage, you know, their view of the customer data, be that whole or partial? I'm not sure that matters, but turn that into the right type of personalization, something that can really deliver for their business.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's about starting with something and sort of, you know, building from there. And and just before, yes, for those listening, please do, add questions. I can see a few coming through already, but, use the chat and, we'll hopefully be able to answer all of your questions. But yeah, Ian, how do people, start, partial or, data, and how do you start to build on personalization? And I certainly see that there's this I'll just move through, this sort of scale of personalization where a lot of companies that we're working with, they understand the power of personalization and what it means to the overarching customer experience. And we use this framework and personalization maturity model to work with customers to understand where to get the biggest bang for buck, and map out a strategic plan to move forward. And these are things that you and I have worked with customers on, and we provide the technology and you provide the support and implementation. But it's about going, well, you can start with just one channel, perhaps the website. Eventually the goal is this true one-to-one personalization where every customer journey is brilliantly personalized. But again, this nirvana, it's something to aspire to and move towards. But just a few examples, how do you help customer experience when you've only got a few data angles and data points? And this is something that as marketers we need to think about and go, how do we help customers? And so here's an example where there's a customer who, he thinks he's lost his card. He doesn't really want to speak to someone, doesn't know what to do, so he Googles it, and so what we're going to talk about here is how do we, what is it that we as a brand want to do? Well, we want to recognize who he is. We want to understand the mentality, the urgency, and we want to make things simple. That's what we want to do. So we don't need a lot of data for this. If we think about, someone comes onto the FAQ site on your website, public page, they're not logged in, and they look at, how do I've lost my card. Obviously in the FAQs it says, well, log in and tell us. So customer logs in, but we know this now, and so this means that as soon as Sean logs in, we can show this message that says, have you lost your card? We can easily deal with that. The customer goes through and we confirm the card is frozen, and that pop-up directing them to what they want is just based on knowing the browsing behavior before they logged in. We can take it a step further where we can send push notifications and recommendations on how to unfreeze the card. But again, it's just about looking at the overarching customer journey, looking at the pain points, looking at what data you have and going, what can we do with it that will help the overall customer experience? Another really good example that I always like to talk about is one of our customers, Danske Bank, and they've really simplified their content strategy, delivering more responsive design, but they introduced personalization based on the context of the customer's life stage, and so they've looked at, are they buying a house? Are they a young couple? Are they getting married? Do they have kids going to school? All of those sorts of things. And they've created a much more simplified and optimized design, more modern, and you can see the stats and they really speak for themselves in terms of customer feedback, increase in leads, all because they're talking in the right way. So, 31% of the product information is, more engaging. We know that it's allowing Danske Bank to use the information they have about their customers to deliver the better experience. And so, it is all about, starting small, building over time, focusing in on the customer. Does that, I think that sort of summarizes a lot. I mean, is that sort of good, from a conclusion of the research?
Yeah. I that's kind of stimulated loads of thoughts in my head. My mind was racing there, thinking about all kinds of banking experiences. I think it kind of really joins up with everything that we're thinking. It's interesting. Obviously, the research only paints one side of that picture, but the things that you've talked about paints the other side of the picture. Now, it's almost like if we can just join those together and have those conversations with those brands, I think some of the challenges that I talked about earlier in terms of this kind of data mountain that people want to kind of ignore instead of working out how to navigate, I think some of it starts to go away really easily. I mean, that's my personal view on it.
And you talk about kind of what the research is covering. Something which is, in recent years, I look at, particularly in financial services, the maturity of the organizations. And what I'm seeing is, there's a lot, particularly in the sector of this move to the cloud. So, especially SaaS as well. I think we've all got used to the idea of managed service and cloud, and whether it's AWS, Azure, or whoever having private or managed cloud instances. But we're all seeing this move to sort of SaaS. Obviously this is important in the context of data. What is there anything coming out from the research on that?
Yeah, I think, and this is interesting. It probably it feeds this idea of a 15-year maturity stretch gap, however it is we want to talk about it, because obviously cloud is a key part of that. And I recognize, even within the conversations that we have with brands, not a misunderstanding of cloud, but probably within the sector around security and just understanding what is this data and where does it really live and where is this cloud, and the financial sector has far stricter rules than other sectors around this type of stuff. So I recognize that maybe the adoption is relatively slow. So our research shows that over a third of businesses, so not a huge amount, but it's moving in the right direction, currently store their data in the cloud. And encouragingly, that's going to kind of rise to 2/3 by 2024. So actually, they're on a kind of a rapid move. If you think about the size of the sector and the data that it owns, that's a huge migration. That's a huge change that's happening. And obviously, many businesses already have a kind of a hybrid mix of kind of on-premise or in cloud. And I think it's our report says that that's basically a third, to be precise. And that will kind of start to shrink, obviously. So that's going to kind of drop down to a quarter by 2024. So again, those kind of, if you think that that's the tide moving in and out properly, and by then I think it's 1 in 7, 1 in 8 brands will remain on premise. So it'll start to become rarer and rarer and rarer. Another question just that I had for you, because it's kind of weaved into some of the slides and the things that you've talked about. As much as cloud is a kind of a thing, and again, you've mentioned SaaS already. Obviously, within the business, we talk about and we hear a lot of questions around Mac architecture. For the attendees, I just thought it might be useful just to hear your kind of view on that, Mike. What is that really? What does that look like? How can it help financial services?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. And that journey that you have identified in the research and that we're seeing in the market, where financial services moving cloud-based, is this notion of SaaS. And a lot of that has to do with why, of moving to this Mac architecture that you mentioned. And so just for the people, on the call, so Mac stands for microservices based, API first, cloud native, and headless. And this is, for us at Cycle, this is really our guiding principle with what we're doing from a product roadmap perspective. We've identified that there's a huge technology debt that organizations have. So we know that companies spend on average like 28% of their budgets. This is financial services, spend on average 28% of their tech budget on addressing technology debt. And what I mean by that is, siloed solutions, outdated technology that you can't get rid of. Now that 28% becomes quite interesting when you say that almost the same number, 33%, is spent on innovation. And the reason, and so you go, well, you need to spend more on innovation, you need to grow more. And so this is why a lot of organizations are moving to this Mac architecture, or actually this composable architecture, an adaptable and composable architecture that allows organizations to rationalize and add to their current stack. So it's not just robust enough for today's challenge, but it can be agile for tomorrow's challenges. And this is when you think about Mac, because composable is all about following that Mac architecture and having the microservices API first cloud. It means that you can integrate with other systems. It's easier to react or preempt recent trends and market conditions. So this is why people like Gartner say that organizations that adopt a composable approach will outpace competition by 80% in the speed of new implementations. So, that's by 2023. So that's in 12 months' time. So we know that a composable architecture, one where you can sort of plug in and pull out technology easily, is a leading strategy. And that's powered through the Mac architecture. And that's the microservices API. And so that's why it becomes so important. And this is where we're certainly going to start to see, organizations going, we might be building core banking platforms, but there's always going to be legacy technology. So how can you use APIs to connect with them? Customers that I talk to all of the time are looking for this composable approach. So that's what, from a technology perspective, something to certainly look at.
I can't see, I think questions are coming in, but I can't see them. You probably can, Mike.
Let me just see, I can. So here's one for you, Ian. So thinking about all of the work that you do with customers, where do you start? What's the starting point for getting better use of data? So that's not the right. I'm paraphrasing the question, but it's how where do you start? I think there's many angles. Many ways to skin a cat, I suppose. My view on it, and you touched on this earlier, is about keeping it simple. If one of the biggest barriers and blockers is the complexity and the scale, then step away from that completely. Forget that. And I think it's about just understanding some of the really, if you kind of took your kind of customer journey flow, for want of a better phrase, and understood the key touch points that really affect the life of your customer and their engagement with you in a bank. Just, you could draw that on a piece of paper. And just understand some of the data exchanges that happen at those points, which again should be probably really, really simple. And just starting to ask yourselves, are you using those levers? Is there an exchange there? Are you giving anything back? Is there any value? And just kind of mapping it like that. There's another way of looking at it, which is actually, I think, and I'm not sure this is within our research, but certainly it's within our experience, is that all organizations across all sectors have little tiny areas of brilliance where they've really, really cracked something quite interesting. And just because of their sheer scale or silos, that isn't something that necessarily is demonstrated across their entire kind of ecosystem or estate. So if I think about financial services and my own experience, I love the fact that the bank that one of the banks that I bank with, their security journey is really slick. I feel really confident and I trust them that if suddenly a decent amount of money leaves my account, they go through some very, very quick steps between desktop and mobile app and a few other things that that kind of let me approve that and therefore move the money fast because it's important to me, at the same time as making sure that it's not fraudulent activity. And for me, that's, biometric stuff, blinking
blinking into my phone to approve, even when actually the core of my journey has been on desktop, some of that stuff. So if you think about that as a journey where there's some really interesting data exchanges that just make life easier for the customer and make them trust you more, what's a simple version of that somewhere else in your business? And what would be the easiest way to kind of replicate it quickly as a proof of concept, and just try it, but keep it really, really, really simple. So I think all of the brands are doing something amazing. It's almost like finding I talk about bottling lightning. I think it's about finding that little piece of lightning in your existing approach and just transferring it, internal innovation, just transfer it into something else, try something a little bit different, minimal data touch points, and just explore. My gut tells me that that's possibly better than what you've currently got in market. That's my view.
So actually, almost the answer is just start, I suppose.
Yeah, the short version of what I just said is start. Yeah,
I really like what you say there about looking at the customer journey. Mapping that out, and that's certainly an exercise that I've done with a lot of customers over the years that has really helped solidify some of the thinking, and understand where to go and help. So I'm not seeing any other questions come through. I'm also sort of conscious of time. We are sort of coming up to the top of when we were sort of scheduled for. So obviously, please reach out if you have any other questions for Ian or myself. As a follow-up, everyone who has registered and is watching the session now or on demand will receive an email with the white paper. Please do take a read. There'll be lots of ways to contact us to follow up if you've got questions, and just for any sort of help and support. But before we close out, Ian, any final words from yourself?
I just think, it's back to that last question, really, Mike. It's about just starting. Dip your toe in, speak to your existing partners or new partners. By all means, as Mike said, reach out to us or Sitecore or whoever, and just kind of try to explore that simple version. How can you just have a play around with this and break down those barriers and that kind of stigma attached with the size of the task? And start to kind of prove that to other stakeholders in your business, and it will just unlock rapidly, as we've seen that move, the shift on cloud. So it's an open door that everybody's kind of moving through, and I'm just really keen for certainly the brands that I know, regardless of whether or not I work for them, to be in the positive side of all of those stats that I mentioned. If there is a 50% split, be in the right 50%.
Well, there you go. I think that's a great call to action. Make sure you read the research and ask yourself the question throughout: where do you sit in all of these stats? What side do you sit? So I think that's a great way to kind of wrap up and conclude. So that which just leaves me to say thank you to everyone for listening. Especially thank you to Ian for taking some time out and joining us, and really proving the partnership that we have with Sagittarius. And yes, look forward to speaking to you on the next webinar, next podcast very, very soon. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.